Thank you very much for being here this morning. My name is Dave Wright, and I will be your moderator for this panel. And I'm very pleased to say that I have 4 panel members that are going to be very helpful in dealing with the issue of climate resilience today. Starting on my very far left is a very important person. That's Leon van Wyk, who's the CEO of Lesedi, and we'd just like to acknowledge them for sponsoring this particular session. Thank you very much, Leon. Next to Leon is DDG Mbambo from the Department of Minerals Resources and Energy. Then we have Gordon Lang, who is from SEE Sustainability. And then close right next to me is Dr. Zenzele Masipa, who is from the National Cleaner Production Center of South Africa. So without further ado, may I just start with the introduction to the issue of climate resilience. It's quite clear from the latest UNEP emissions gap report, which was published in November 24, that the ability for us as a globe to meet the 1.5 target is actually going to be very, very difficult. And the current indices that are on the table and due to be submitted in Brazil later this year will need to show that there have to be massive reductions in order to meet the 1.5. So given that the 1.5 target is unlikely to be met, it looks as though we're in for a rough ride. We're already seeing signs of extreme weather events in all parts of the world, including South Africa. You just have to think about the problems that we've had in KZN and recently in other parts of South Africa. So it's really important that we, in South Africa and in Africa, begin to think and look at the whole issue of climate resilience and how do we deal with the significant changes that we expect to see coming through in our climate and experience that we have as a consequence of climate. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to each of the panel members and ask them firstly to introduce themselves and then to make their comments. And I think I'd like to start, if I may, not with the lady, but with Leon.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning to everyone. This topic is an extremely important one, and I don't think it's a topic that gets enough attention today. You know, you talk about the 1.5 degrees temperature rise that we need to avert through climate change. The reality is we are living climate change. We just need to look at what's happening in Zimbabwe and in Zambia at the moment, with Lake Kariba running dry. And with poor rainfall, those two countries are struggling to meet their energy demands. And they are so reliant on hydro energy that without the dam levels resurging, they won't be able to generate electricity, and without electricity, they cannot pump water to communities. So we're not only faced with electricity crisis, but it could become humanitarian crisis if we are not careful. So climate change is not something that is going to happen in the future. We all talk about we need to reduce carbon emissions to avert climate change. Climate change is already here. The question is, how do we deal with the effects of climate change and how do we design for the future? Now, it's very important to understand that not a single technology would be able to overcome this challenge. We need to have a mix of technologies installed, and not only in South Africa, I'm talking about the continent, in order to have enough resilience in the system that if a certain technology does get affected from time to time, that there are other technologies that can take up their place. Secondly, I think it's extremely important that we have a strong interconnected grid. You know, if you look at what's happening with renewable energy at the moment, there are a lot of behind-the-meter installations which are weakening the grids in many areas of South Africa. By weakening the grid, we expose the most vulnerable people in the society, those that cannot afford to have self-generation installed. Now, if you look at Lake Kariba, again back to Zimbabwe and Zambia, if the Southern Africa power pool is strong enough to pick up the delta that hydropower station cannot supply, we are able to secure livelihoods in those countries. So the interconnectivity of grids, and particularly if we bring it back to home, the Southern Africa power pool will be extremely important, but also important to have them be able to go into islanding mode. Secondly, thirdly, I think the important element for us to really take cognizance of is we need better planning and include climate change in our infrastructure development plan and in our IRP, because at the moment, those elements are looked at from a decarbonization perspective, but not necessarily how climate change are affecting the patterns of weather and how patterns of weather are affecting our ability to use technologies.
Thanks very much, Leon. Appreciate that. DDG, your views, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to the members of the panel and the audience. I think the issue of climate resilience is an important one. What I think we need to do is that we need to have an energy system that adequately responds to the climate change obligations. In as far as the energy sources are concerned, from the South African perspective, is that we implement the energy mix. So I agree fully with my panel member that we need a mix of energy solutions that is adapted to each of the different countries, locally and regionally and globally. One of the points that was highlighted is that we're not going to meet the 1.0 come 2050. I would like to put an argument that says it has already been agreed globally that to achieve the net zero by 2050, we need all energy sources. In particular, it has been accepted that we will not be able to achieve the net zero by 2050 if we don't include nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is part of the solution, and there has been now a global agreement at COP28 where it was agreed that globally we have to accelerate nuclear and renewables so that nuclear then provides clean baseload electricity, stable electricity that we need for us to achieve the net zero by 2050. So there is a solution. The solution lies in us implementing nuclear as part of our baseload energy solution. Notwithstanding that we need all the energy sources, each of the countries would have to leverage on the resources that they have. But for countries where there is an opportunity to implement the nuclear energy, it is this solution that we are looking for. It provides massive infrastructure development, job creation, and also in terms of its design life. The new designs, the Generation 3 and Generation 4, have a design life of 60 years, and this can also be then extended by another 20 years. So we are looking into a robust infrastructure that would last at least 80 years to provide a solution towards clean energy. So I think we need to have that conversation and look into all the energy sources, but our solution lies with nuclear as one of the baseload energy sources that we require. I'd like to end there.
Thank you, DDG. I just want to put everyone on notice. The Q&A session is not going to devolve into a debate on nuclear energy. If it does, I'm going to cut it off. Right. Gordon, your turn, sir.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm going to step away from energy in terms of resilience. I work in the sustainability sector overall. And while we talk about resilience and energy resilience, I think That is one aspect of resilience. Resilience really speaks to the ability for society and the environment to survive and thrive. And whilst we're talking about energy generation, if we think about the metropolitan areas throughout Africa, the contribution to the consumption of energy by metropolitan areas is 40% often of the energy consumption of the areas, and that's in transport. So while we have a conversation around energy resilience and reduction in energy usage or shifting energy usage, we really have to bring the transport sector into it very, very strongly, which then opens the conversation even further in terms of, if we think about Africa and what's happening in Africa, Southern Africa, we are warming at double the global rate at the moment. That's a tremendous concern. So we're going to have extreme droughts. It's really, Leon spoke about Kariba and Zimbabwe and Zambia. The Southern African region is effectively in a 5-year extreme drought at the moment, irrespective of the cyclones that are coming as well. So, I mean, we have both these extremes sitting. The other issue in Africa is that we're the fastest growing population continent-wise. So we are going to have tremendous demands on all our resources, not just energy, but everything else throughout Africa. So our cities are growing at rapid rates. And the inefficiencies of cities, the urban sprawl that is generated by the current sort of planning patterns and development patterns really contributes to a significant uptake of inefficient energy in terms of transport. So what we really need to do in AR6, this was clearly identified, is look to avoid what is known as avoid, shift, and improve. And green is really the improve aspect. That's the technological improvements of whatever it is we're trying to do, the energy, electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, nuclear at one level, but renewable energy at the other level. And that's the shift side of the conversation. The other side of the conversation is the avoid and shift. How do we avoid needing to use energy? Our urban form contributes to that massively. If we change urban form, we provide affordable, equitable, sustainable access to opportunity to everybody if we densify and create mixed use areas. We can then at the same time as we do that, change the areas into habitable urban form where people can live, work, walk, play in areas that are not heat exposed as much as they currently are. And then the shift is changing the way we use things. So really in the transport sector, we're talking about moving from private motor vehicles, the congestion conversation, into public transport and active mobility as the key drivers. The cities, and we've got to envisage what our cities could look like in 50 years' time. By 2050, what do the working, functioning, really livable cities look like? And we talk about 15-minute precincts where people have access within 15 minutes walking or cycling of everything they need. And that includes access to really good public transport. So if we're talking about energy resilience, we've got to shift away, and there's a massive paradigm shift, which is quite often very difficult for engineers who are trying to think reductionistically, but there's a paradigm shift away from the current planning processes that reinforce congestion. We design cities to cope with motor cars rather than designing cities to be really functioning, well-functioning for people. And that is a significant shift that we've got to do. So we can't carry on trying to build our way out of the highly energy consumptive travel patterns that we've got at the moment. We've got to look at it very, very differently. And by doing that, we'll create the opportunity for societies to thrive.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for broadening the discussion and taking us away from just directly looking at the energy issues, but clearly relating it to the energy issues. Last but not least, we kept the best to last, of course. Dr. Zenzele, your views, please.
It is really an honor today to be engaging in a subject that is, or rather that has a huge implication in terms of our future, the African resilience in climate change. I'll be adding as well, like my fellow panel member, in terms of climate resilience, focusing more on the inside on how skills development play a crucial role in resilience and climate change and how it can help Africa navigate challenges ahead. My fellow panelists have touched on important points that looks at innovation, energy generation, and they also touched on the energy water food nexus, where I would also be diving more onto that. I think climate change, it has an impact. and then we can see it. And these challenges have tangible impacts, such as, seeing crop fail, infrastructure being destroyed, and the whole community being, displaced. And the World Bank as well has estimated that by 2050, climate change could push an additional of 100 million of Africans into poverty. So what does that mean in terms of resilience? Resilience is not just about adapting to these changes, but it's about anticipating them and building systems, both physical and human, that can absorb the shock and continue to function. When we talk about resilience, we often focus on the infrastructure, building strong defense systems, sustainable energy system, but there's one important overlooked factor, that is people. So looking at building capital, skills development, knowledge to respond to the challenge, and which is also a critical part of resilience. So what skills are we talking about? We're talking about green economy skills, your renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable agriculture. Africa has an immense potential. We've got solar, hydro, wind that are abundant. But in order for us to fully leverage on these resources, we need skills development and skill force. We're talking about artisan, engineers, energy specialists. Same with the sustainable agriculture, which is also another area that skills development can make a difference. Climate change is affecting our food system, as one of the panelists have said, making an example with Zimbabwe. And also from being from a background of, applied research and project work, I once worked in one of the communities in Limpopo, where we fully focused on putting in a system for, production of energy, cleaner energy. But we've also realized that how that cannot just work in silos, but it's almost energy, food, and water nexus, where the water has actually caused I could say, pushed a bit of poverty into the community, where crops, and rainfall patterns have affected the crop production. So such skills development in sustainable farming practices, climate change, crop variations, water management could have helped the community in managing, the effect of the climate change. It is also important for us to acknowledge that there is barrier that exists in terms of skills development. That is access to training and education, and in many African countries, there is limited access to high-quality specialized programs that focus on green skills. But again, these are the challenges that can be overcome. I mean, I've seen, success projects where the NGOs, government, and private sector come together to roll out skills program. That then takes me to my important point to say intentional investment in education and skills development is not just a solution for today, but it's also an investment for future resilience. So what can we do going forward? Looking at intentional, scalable training programs, building, resilient skills in every sector and beyond. And secondly, strengthening the link between research, education, and private sector, fostering the partnership between research and the private sector. And again, to empower our local communities. Climate change may be a global challenge, but it's also felt locally. So we have the resources, we've got the resources, we've got the people. Just now we need to invest in the skills, the right skills, so that we can see, so that we can make resilience a reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Zeli, and it's great that you bring the people aspect into the discussion, so thank you very much for that. Leon made an interesting comment before we came on the panel, on the stage, in that it seems unusual in an energy conference to be talking about resilience. Now, the thing, it's my perception that there isn't enough discussion around resilience and there isn't enough happening in resilience. I ask my panel members whether they agree with me, and if we aren't doing enough, what is it that we should be doing and can start doing right away to make a difference? Who'd like to have a go?
Dave, perhaps I can start. Let's take South Africa as an example, what we've done with the REAP program and how well we've been able to embed renewable energy into our market. One thing that we are not looking at is the fact that if you now start incorporating Southern Africa Power Pool as an example, the frequency management in our electrical systems are of utmost importance. And we're getting to that point where we've rapidly been able to implement renewable energy, but due to climate change, our renewable technologies will also be more intermittent than what they are at the moment, which brings frequency control and our ability to not load shed, as an example, to protect the grid, becomes ever more complex. Now, if we go back to the example of Zambia and Zimbabwe, because I think that's an extremely topical point, because they are living that reality at the moment. Lake Kariba is 15%, I think, at the end of last week. They are having to stop power generation due to the fact that they will also need to curb water use. So Lake Kariba on the Zambia and Zimbabwe side each gives just roughly over 1,000 megawatts. If you look at the grid of Zimbabwe, they have roughly 2,500 megawatts peak consumption. That is half of the electricity at a single point which gets affected. Now, I agree, nuclear is definitely part of the solution. Now, if we take mature nuclear technology, large reactors, currently between 1,000, 1,400 megawatts a unit. Again, we sit in a Lake Kariba situation. If that plant is out for maintenance, half of the power generation in that area is no longer. Hence, interconnectivity on a grid becomes so important to be able to deal with where weather patterns are affecting our ability to generate, that we can move to other generation sources without impacting the availability of electricity. But that gets compounded now by lack of infrastructure development in transmission and distribution. Again, if you look at Zimbabwe, they have roughly 40% transmission losses in their network. So although we can generate electricity in South Africa, if we had to transmit that to various areas within Zimbabwe, 40% of the electricity gets lost due to the aging infrastructure. Now, weather patterns that are changing are affecting rainfall. That's one thing that we are talking about. But most technologies of power generation use water in one way or the other. If we look at nuclear, we require water for cooling. Hydro obviously uses water, but even solar panels, we need water to clean the panels. So we need to look at a very innovative way of how can we manage these technologies in a system where we can start predicting what weather patterns are going to do. And that's the key, is how do we plan for weather better? You know, if you look at installations that have been done recently that were built as an example on previous wetland areas, people get amazed by the fact that with changing weather, previous wetlands become wetlands again. And we need to be sensitive that climate change is not only bringing about change in weather, but it also brings about previous weather patterns that we did have comes back more frequently. So if you look at, for an example, how do we plan for flood levels? You plan either for a 50 or 100-year flood level. Perhaps that 100-year flood level is no longer 100 years. Maybe that's a 10-year flood level. And those are the sort of things that we really need to be critical of. And in South Africa, we have a plan which gets criticized, which is the IRP. And that is just due to the lack of speed in which this thing is developing. The reality is, if we don't bring in climate resilience, and resilience is a proactive element, it means that we are planning for something to happen. We will see ourselves fail in the near future due to our lack of planning. And I think, you know, the comment on skills development is an excellent one. Renewable energy, for all practical purposes from a technical perspective, is not as complex as what we have thermal coal or the complexity of nuclear. And if we are moving into that direction, which we should absolutely do, training of people becomes extremely important. One, to implement technologies, but two, also how do we plan better and aid communities to be ready for climate change?
Yeah.
Thanks, Leon. Any other points anyone would like to make? Gordon?
Yeah, and I think just building on what Leon has just said, the critical thing in all of this is we can have conversations around energy, but we live in a very interconnected, on a very interconnected planet, in a very interconnected society. And I think part of the conversation earlier was, should we not have a Department of Resilience? And in many ways, I think the broader suggestion is that you have a Department of Integration, because we have many conversations, and we're having a conversation in any energy conference around resilience. Resilience is not just about energy. It's as I said earlier on, it's the ability of society and the environment to thrive and survive. And it's not deliberate and it's not intentional, but we often end up in silos. And the critical thing, and Dr. Zinzeli spoke to it, the critical thing is an awareness of how things are interconnected and how it's so important that everybody is aware of whatever it is that they're doing has an impact somewhere else. I'll give one example of limited thinking. Massive floods in the Western Cape for a couple of years. A bridge is built to avoid the floods. And you were saying earlier on, Leon, you know, the design is for a 1 in 1,000 year flood, basically, which is now probably happening 1 in 100 years, possibly. That bridge is a very, very expensive bridge to build. Resilience requires that we have funds released to actually deal with disasters and do things differently. So what we're doing is we're committing to building our way out of a problem rather than thinking our way out of a problem. If you drive through the Karoo, the bridges are very low-level bridges. And one of the reasons that they built this high bridge was because of what happened in KZN, when whole bridges were moved because of the trees that got caught against the piers, and then the plastic that got caught against the trees that actually created a dam wall, and the water pressure was so big that the bridges on the N2 actually moved downstream a couple of meters. That was in the cyclones that we had recently. What if we designed our bridges so that they were low level enough for the trees to go over the top of the bridge, cost maybe 1/10 of an expensive bridge? We may have to close that road for a day or two, but at least we've actually released funds to do something elsewhere. That requires a very, very different way of thinking, a very, very integrative way of thinking, and strong collaboration. So I think the conversation around resilience, yes, we're not having the conversation on a broad basis, and we need to start that, and it is happening. And one of the cities in South Africa has actually got a Department of Resilience with a head that has just been appointed. So they're seeing it as a fundamental departure point for their planning processes. And throughout Africa, if we start that conversation very rapidly, we will deal with the resilience issues that are actually starting to confront us, and the societal issues that are starting to confront us on a much broader basis. And we cannot carry on designing and thinking in isolation. So we've got to move to this full awareness and collaboration processes that such a department may well be able to facilitate.
Thanks, Gordon. In terms of your point about a Department of Resilience, DDG Mbambo, does the presidency not play that role at the moment, or is there a different group in the government system that should be or is looking at resilience?
No, thanks for the question. I think from a government perspective, we've got a Department of Environmental Forests and Fisheries, which is the custodian of all climate change policies and legislation that are being rolled out and are implemented in government. So that's the authority in as far as climate change issues are concerned. But we also have other departments that needs to be able to design their policies in such a way that they respond to the national policies that would have been set up by the DEF in dealing with the matter of climate change. And also, we have the Presidential Climate Change Commission, which is also seized with the matter of how we as a country respond to climate change challenges and be able to have systems that are resilient and deliver to our needs without negatively impacting on the environment. So there is quite a a well-knit system in government that respond to issues of climate change. We also are signatories in international obligations like the Paris Agreement that governs how we deal with environmental issues in the country. And also, specifically, let me just put an example that demonstrates how we deal with issues of climate change. We've got a nuclear energy policy in the country that determines that nuclear energy shall form part of the South Africa strategy to mitigate climate change. So that's just but one of the policies that we are implementing as we are expanding nuclear in the country, guided by this policy directive. And also other departments have to set up policies that respond to how we as a country are dealing with issues of climate change. Of course, there is a National Treasury developed the Green Taxonomy Policy, which is currently under review, which facilitates that investments should be looked into and be directed towards energy solutions that mitigate climate change. So there is quite a broad work that is done in government, and there is authority in terms of departments that are running with this process. And we are all responding to that and making sure that we're able to mitigate the impact of climate change in the country. Thanks.
Thanks, DDG. Yeah, go ahead, Leon.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because while you were talking, it made me think of the role that our national standards play in everything that we're doing and what we are discussing today. You know, if one element that we must be cognizant of is to plan for resilience is going to increase cost of electricity, it will increase cost to access to energy. And, you know, as well as the intentions might be from various people in the energy sector, if it's not going to be a standard requirement in our SAN standard and so forth to adapt design policy for resilience planning, we will not make the inroads that we need to make. And the reality is, yes, it will increase the costs up front, but it will save us cost in the long term due to the fact that disaster management and the impact of weather would be so much less. And I think that's a discussion that is not necessarily held at this point in time, is how do we affect and action our Bureau of Standards and so forth in order to be able to plan for these things and make it mandatory for design authorities to be able to implement resilient planning in their execution of work.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. I think it's a very good point. You're essentially saying invest for the future. The big question for me, though, is how do you convince people that that's worthwhile? I mean, people are interested in spending money now and what it's costing them, what's going out of their pockets right now. So I think that gets us back to the point that Dr. Zinzeli raised about education. And so, Dr. Zinzeli, what should we be doing as a country and as a continent in terms of helping people to understand this concept of investing for the future?
Okay. So I normally say you are a movement by yourself, but it's a force when people are together. So, you know, gathering what has been said, you know, the most important point for me will be that strong link and collaboration. The triple helix model where there is government, so we understand what's the role of the government in terms of technology and innovation. Where does the private sector play into that? And again, the high learning institution and research and development, because that's where, in terms of bringing in the community, take place in terms of, you know, validation and impact, designing for impact, so that then drive into resilience. So if we fully understand the collaborative and the role of the collaborators each stakeholder plays, then it's a way to resilience. Yes, we understand there might be very interesting technologies that come in terms of assisting with climate change, but are we ready in terms of skills? Are we skilled enough to take up that opportunity? That's where now this collaboration plays a huge role in terms of, is the learning institution, I know, producing professionals that are able to service whatever technology? Are we sharing enough information? on the ground in terms of technology that are coming to address the point of climate change and being resilient.
Thanks, Dr. Zinzeli. Is there anything we should be doing within the schooling system with regard to understanding the concept and the requirement for resilience in a way that school kids can actually absorb and take it in, rather than just focusing at, if I can call it, at the back end of the education pipeline? Should we be doing something at the lower end?
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, education has to start from the lowest level. As I've said, bringing in our communities in terms of climate change and the resilience element, also assist them to cope better and able to function effectively as well. As I've made an example about sustainable agriculture, we know we are big in farming in South Africa and in Africa in general. So, but then we have the impacts of climate change, the rainfall patterns. So how do we then teach our community in terms of being, resilient and accept the changes or the challenges rather, and then being able to function within that, So yes, we've addressed to say, energy is not just standing alone, but also affects the water and the food system. That then, as I've said, the World Bank is also estimating that by 2050, this climate change might push an additional of 1 million people into poverty when we look at Africa. So it's important for us to, skill up, workshop people from the ground as well, so that we are all looking into the future and planning together when we look at climate change and resilience.
Thanks. Yes, Gordon.
I think just building on that, if I look at the regions or cities that have actually been very successful in this space, I'm going to use Copenhagen and Catalonia as two examples. Catalonia identified that the biggest issue that they had in their drive towards net zero, and then it broadened out into the broader sustainability conversation, but the biggest issue was a gap in understanding. So you had the technical experts recognizing that there needed to be shift and change, but the general public, the government officials, right across the board, the regional, Catalonia is obviously a region, sort of similar to the Western Cape, also with its own escape kind of approach, but they wanted to go independent, but they haven't. But what they did was they recognized that the biggest thing that they had to do was create an awareness of the need to change across the board. So it was right from school level to community level, and they engaged the communities in their conversations around what needed to change, well, why things needed to change, what needed to change, and then how they could go about doing it. And the real success in both Catalonia and Copenhagen was that everybody was taken through that process. Copenhagen had a 25-year strategy for the redesign of their city to become a resilient city. They reckon that they achieved that in 20 years, but the very first thing that they did was they took every single official in the city through that process. So they knew exactly where everybody was in the process. And I think that's really what we need to be striving towards doing. And the PCC, the DDG is absolutely right. The PCC is doing a lot of work, and it's a very cross-cutting organization. It doesn't really, it's a legislated body at one level, but it makes recommendations, and it is doing tremendous work. It has a Department of Resilience in it, or a section that is looking at resilience in it. And that section has shifted from pure energy into other sectors as well. Right at the moment, there's a just transition in transport conversation happening, which is a broader conversation. And that's really the process that we, and when I say we, I'm talking about us in Africa. And we need to take the examples of cities that are working well, where cities are actually doing things, or regions are doing things well, consider that, and consider in our own contexts how we could adopt or change or use those kind of processes, and actually be very, very willing to actually share those processes across the board. But the critical thing is this raising of awareness for everybody. And the doctor is right. It happens at primary school level, young level, all the way through to the elderly, who often have a contribution to make it in a different way.
Yes, Darren.
Kids are our future. And the easiest way to influence the future is to get the misconceptions of today resolved through proper education. It's very difficult to have an informed discussion with the general public today about energy and understanding why we need an energy mix. It's a lot easier to teach children how that energy mix are influencing our daily lives so that decisions can be made in the future of a different nature. And I think that is an excellent observation, is we need to go down to root level in order to be able to solve the problem of tomorrow, because we are talking about this topic too late, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. Do you think Mr. Trump's arrival is going to have any effect on the issue of resilience in Africa and South Africa? You may have a very short response, you might have a very long response. If you've got a short one, give it to us quickly. If you've got a long one, don't talk. I'm kidding. Anyone want to take it up? Start. Gordon?
Well, I think there's a one-word answer. The answer is yes.
Thank you.
It's going to have a massive effect. But if we just step back a little bit, we're seeing a realignment starting to happen right away. You know, Keir Starmer stood up on Sunday night and gave a very, very powerful speech. And really that, you know, what is happening is people are recognizing that they've actually got to step into the space. And that stepping in is starting to happen right now. And it's not just around the Ukraine issue. It's around all the other issues as well. You know, what the US is doing at the moment is just overturning the boat, basically. And when that happens, you've got to get into lifeboats. And I think that's really what's starting to happen, is that we're looking at the lifeboats and how we can keep those going and then build from that. And in many ways, that goes back to the earlier conversation. We can start an education process at one level, but what we've got to do, everything that we've got to do, we've got to consider the longer term. What are we doing now that will either lock us out of being able to do something, or will open up the opportunities for us to actually create a resilient future? And often we lock things out by siloed thinking. And I think what has happened from the and I don't want to use a name, but the US situation is forcing people to think differently and actually talk to each other at a different level. And I think that's one of the benefits. It's not necessarily the nice time to have to do it, but we've got to do it, and it's one of the benefits coming out of this, basically.
The reality is that change usually happens when there's a disruption of sorts. And what we are seeing on a global stage now is massive disruption. And that disruption is also reminding countries that irrespective of, you know, your own policies locally, global effects affects your country. And how do you become self-reliant in order to protect yourself as an independent state? And that, for me, is going to bring positive change and positive actions, because there are many countries that are very reliant on others, and they are looking at others for support. And with disruption like we are seeing now, that is being a rethinking process is currently ongoing, and people will take control and action more locally than thinking on a global stage. So yes, there's a disruption. Whether it's good or bad, we'll have to see. But disruption, in my mind, always brings about positive change at the end. It's uncomfortable in the situation, but positivity will come out of it.
Thanks, Leon. Any other comments?
Yes, well, we are observing the global developments, and we think they provide an opportunity, in particular for us in the African region, that we need to rethink how we deal with the energy security and supply for our continent. And I'd like to impress upon the point that as the continent, we are endowed with resources that are used for energy. And I'll take an example that if you look into the resources that we have, we've got a lot of uranium resources in Africa that should be able to assist us as the continent to leverage on our position, because we know that uranium is a source material for energy generation. What is happening now is that we're mining the uranium from the continent and we export it for the value to be derived elsewhere. And we now need to rethink and say, how do we leverage on our uranium resources such that we add value here in the continent so that we're able to leverage on the climate change mitigation strategy, because as there's now a global acceptance that nuclear energy is indispensable to achieve the net zero by 2050, it means we as Africa, if we have the uranium resources, they are placing us into a competitive position wherein we're able to ensure that there's security of energy supply. And we need to be able to participate into the full value chain to derive the benefit for peaceful purposes in the continent. And here in South Africa, we've got the capability in terms of leveraging on our uranium resources. And we think collaboration is going to become a very important going into the future, having to rethink how we ensure that as the continent we're self-sufficient, we're able to leverage on our own resources for our energy generation solutions. So there are opportunities that are brought in by these global developments that are taking place that we should think quite carefully and take the opportunity to ensure that we are self-sufficient as the continent. I'll stop there.
Thanks, DDG. Dr. Zinzeli, any thoughts or comments?
Just to add a bit on that, to say, you know, I've seen a lot of being engaged with a lot of high learning education in terms of now changing the theme into, you know, sustainability, you know, producing professionals that will be able to respond to our challenges in terms of climate change. With different councils for professionals that are reviewing their code of conduct and ethics to say, if we say you are a professional, what kind of skills should you be having to respond to the global trend? I think we have to trust ourselves as Africa to say we have the humans, we have the resources, we just need to invest in terms of upskilling ourselves in order for us to, you know, to be able to respond to the challenges of the future.
Okay, thanks. Two of the themes that have been coming out of this discussion for me are nuclear has a role to play and we need to be educating the kids. But both of those are either 10 or 20-year type time frames for them to have any significant benefit. What is it that we should be doing now to address the issue of resilience? What are the two things, if we go away from this panel, that we should say to anybody? What should we do tomorrow?
It is clear in my mind, at least, that nuclear is definitely part of the future. Nuclear is important, and as you rightfully say, that's 20 years from now. Coal is being phased out. If we take South Africa as an example, our assets are aging. Climate change will influence our ability to also use our coal-fired power stations due to availability of water. If we look at an example, two of the country's biggest power stations are built next to the Limpopo River up in the northern part of the country. An extreme drought in that area would have us lose almost a quarter of power generation capability in South Africa. So even coal-fired will be affected by climate change. Renewable energy brings us as an element of addressing shortcomings in the short term, but they are intermittent of nature. So the question is, how do we support the grid, if we take South Africa as an example, to the point where we have baseload nuclear in the future? And that is where we need another transitional fuel to help in the process of embedding of renewables. So must we increase our renewables? Does renewables have a place in the grid? Absolutely. And we must implement those strategies with vigor. However, gas will play a significant role in us overcoming from where we are today to where we need to be in terms of nuclear. I think from a resilience point of view, nuclear is probably the best technology in the long term in order to be able to cope with climate change. Not only address the reduction of climate change in the future, but apart from water to cool, all the design elements to keep a nuclear power station safe is already being established. We know how to deal with extreme weather. We know how to deal with upset conditions. So nuclear, from a resilience point of view, is an excellent decision. The problem is we need transitional fuels, and wind turbines, contrary to what many people would think, the stronger the wind blows, you don't get more energy out of a wind turbine. You actually need to shut it down because it becomes a very unsafe condition. The intermittency of our renewable energy within our mix has to be coupled with a support system that is able to manage frequency in this country. Otherwise, we're running into a significant problem very shortly. And there is where I believe gas plays a significant role, and we need to push the gas agenda very hard, because at the moment, our time frame for implementation is extremely short.
The big problem with gas, though, is we don't have the infrastructure, and it's going to take time to build the infrastructure. So your gas solution is not a short-term solution. It's a long-term solution.
Definitely so. I would just say not necessarily long-term, but medium-term solution. And that is why it's important for us to start today.
Are we not going to end up with stranded assets, though?
That is an interesting point. That's, you know, over the past few weeks, we were talking about what is the tariff that you would associate for gas generation, because your amortization over that asset needs to happen at a far quicker rate than you would on a typical installation, because it's a transitional fuel. And that comes back to the element that at what cost are we going to be able to have energy security? And that, you know, there's a significant discussion about, is NERSA doing the right thing to push up tariffs? How are we managing the embedding of renewable energy? Yes, solar technology, the price is coming down. It's a cheaper form of electricity. But the problem is a lot more complex than that. And the reality is we are facing energy charges that will have to increase in order for us to have the security that we believe we need to have.
I think part of the solution that we need to look at it very carefully is that we are endowed with coal. So that's a fact we can't run away from. Our electricity is generated through coal. But we know that at some point in future, we will have to decommission these coal-fired power plants when they reach their end of design life. But what we think we should do now is not to start decommissioning our coal-fired power stations before we have a solution that we know that it can provide us the base load. So we think we need to look into how do we leverage on technologies. I heard that you saying to bring gas online, it will require an infrastructure and all of that, and that's true. But if we are saying, okay, we think that we must maybe extend the life of our coal-fired power plants, whilst we're bringing in other solutions that are going to be able to replace the base load that we require, in such a manner that we do not decommission before we have a solution that can generate electricity to secure our energy security as a country. That's the kind of a solution that I think we'll need to look into. There may be a need that at some point in time, these coal-fired power plants, some of them needs to be extended while we're building in energy solutions that have got the long timelines to bring them online in such a way that we're able to complement that there is always going to be a baseload solution that we require as a country to drive our economy. So that's something that we need to look into. And then also, we need to engage the stakeholders to make sure that we can explain the just energy transition and what the impact of it is going to be to their livelihood, and assure the stakeholders that it's not going to leave them in a worse off position wherein jobs will be reduced and there's no equivalent type of an energy solution that comes online that can sustain those communities. So that we need to think of something in that line.
Yeah, I just want to address the element of stranded asset very quickly. In, I think it was 2017, Cape Town almost ran out of water. We invested tremendously in desalination plants for the event that if we had to run out of water, we can have fresh water supply to the community. Today, the effort on desalination in Cape Town is no longer looked at in the same way that it was looked at that point. The reality is Cape Town will face another potential day zero due to climate change. And we can look at those desalination plants as perhaps stranded assets now because of that event. The reality is when that event occurs again, our whole view on those assets will change. If we invest in gas, and even if they just operate 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 years for sustaining this economy, the price is worth it, even if they become stranded assets after that.
I'm not too sure there are private investors that might agree with you then.
And you're absolutely right. And the question is, what role does government need to play in order to subsidize that so that it's attractive enough for private investors to be able to do that? Because the reality is, this is a country problem, this is a regional problem. Private investors have a role to play, and yes, they need their rate of return. And that is a conundrum that we sit with. How do we marry private investment and return on investment with private funds with the need that the country will have? And we need to have that discussion, because currently that discussion is not being held at the right levels.
But the big problem is that the government doesn't have the money to do that. So it's one of these circular situations. Any other points about what we should be doing today?
Yes, I think we need to be thinking about putting plans on how we repurpose the coal-fired power plants as they get decommissioned into the future. And there are technologies that have been proven that they can be used to repurpose the coal-fired power plants, like small modular reactors. In other jurisdictions where they've got a dominance of coal within their energy mix, they're looking into repurposing these coal-fired power plants with small modular reactors. And I think that's a solution also we need to be thinking about here in South Africa. Because in terms of small modular reactors, they've got a number of competitive elements. Short turnarounds in terms of construction, in terms of cost, in terms of utilizing the infrastructure that has been there, and also making sure that you retain the jobs to the same, more or less, level as what was there in the coal-fired power plants. I think that's a solution we also need to consider on how we can plan to repurpose some of the coal-fired power plants with nuclear small modular reactors to be able to leverage on jobs and be able to address the issues of climate change as the challenge that we're facing with.
Thank you. Gordon?
Again, I'm going to step beyond the power generation conversation and into the broader conversation. If we look at the transport contribution to energy consumption in cities, we can start looking at that very, very carefully. And the critical thing here is that we've got to start putting in place now projects and programs, because any of these programs, a power station is a 50-year life cycle, a transport infrastructure is a 30 to 50 to 60-year life cycle, basically. So we have to change the thinking processes right now. And Colorado, for instance, declared a moratorium on any road expansion for what we call single occupancy vehicles, private motor vehicles. And the intention behind that was to shift the funding from road expansion capacity to sustainable transport or sustainable access opportunities. And that then brought the whole conversation of how do cities begin to thrive. So you've got a very, very different shift in the setup. If we start those programs now, my recommendation would be to declare a moratorium on any urban sprawl that happens, because that is really, really inefficient in terms of both energy and societal cost. So declare a moratorium on that, start infilling cities, mixed-use development, shorter distances to travel, lower energy requirements straight away. And immediately that you start doing that, you actually release so much money back into the local economies. The other thing that I would do right now is I would actually really prioritize the reestablishment of urban rail systems throughout South Africa. The most efficient and effective way of moving people around cities, between opportunities, within cities and between opportunities, and the most affordable. So again, you release money into the economy that then contributes to the fiscus in terms of tax and that sort of thing. So, there are short-term solutions that sit outside of the energy conversation that can contribute to this. And one of the things that we do need to do is to relook at our budgeting process and say, okay, how do we really consider the budgeting process in terms of where we're trying to get to in terms of resilience, and what can we do within the budgets now, reallocation of funding to programs and projects that really drive the deep change that we need to actually be a resilient society in 20 to 30 years' time.
Thanks, Gordon. Dr. Zenzele, any thoughts on what to do now?
You know, what I take on this is it's very important for us to start planning, having conversations, identifying stakeholders and mapping them, and again, you know, to drive collaboration in terms of research and development as well. If we were to respond to the future, the plans needs to happen now, the right conversations needs to happen now. So I think that's a very good startup point in terms of responding to climate change and resilience.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard what the panel has to say around the issue of climate resilience, and I'd like to open the floor for any questions, answers, comments.
Morning, everyone. It's Shane from Lesedi. Just a comment on skills development. I was doing a bit of research while you were talking, and I see that in February 2023, there was a climate change curriculum introduced into South African schools, but at a high school curriculum perspective. And I concretely agree, you know, it needs to be at a primary school level. You know, so I'm happy to see that 2 years ago there was something done, and I'll go and look at it and follow up and see, you know, how successful that's been, and has it really been implemented since they said it was in 2023. So I think, you know, the comment on education is a critical one, but I'm just very happy to see that something has been done in South Africa. And for all those other countries that are here today, maybe go and have a look at that and see whether it could be used in your curriculums on the continent. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions? We don't want to make this a Lesedi show, eh?
Morning, my name is Greg Nicholas. Just in terms of what we can do now, and I come back to some of the comments with regards to grid stability, the REAP, and to put a bit of a scenario out there and to understand from the panelists their view. The REAP program was very successful because it handed over the implementation to the private sector and the free market. And as a result of that, it was implemented within time, relatively within budget, and the tariffs came down quite rapidly over time as well because of free market competitiveness. Currently, one of the problems that we have is everybody is looking after their own little issues and not really talking about grid stability. Everybody is looking after their own problems and not thinking about how to actually turn it into something that can rather work for the greater good. We've got mines that are putting in their own PV plants behind the meter, but when that PV plant's not generating, they're relying on Eskom to still provide them with power at 8 o'clock at night in the middle of winter when the PV plant's not generating electricity. So my question is, in order to do something now, how can we use an organization like possibly the South African Power Pool, have it possibly supported by organizations such as the World Bank, IFC, EIB, etc., and put in programs where they release X amount of power requirements from different types of power sources. You can have so much from renewables, so much from wind, so much from PV, so much from gas, and hand that over to the free market to implement, with the understanding that the South African Power Pool will then, to a certain degree, take all that power and then distribute it amongst all of the nations that the South African Power Pool then supports. So the issues like Zambia and Zimbabwe now suffering, if you had a far more integrated grid and power generation around the whole of Southern Africa, you would be able to then support those countries with alternative power generation systems. So I'd like to hand that possible scenario over to the panel and get their views. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
I wholeheartedly agree that the REAP program was an extremely successful program, and it's a model that can be used worldwide. The reality is, when we started investing in solar, it was the same discussion that we're now having with gas. It was too expensive. But if you put it in the merit system over the whole system, you could cross-subsidize through other generation capacities. Now, if we were to include gas, and yesterday we had another discussion where we even included nuclear in that discussion, from an IPP perspective over a reprogram, I believe that can be an extremely cost-effective and elegant way to solve a complex problem, because you leave implementation to the private sector, yet you take away the off-take risk, as governments at the end of the day would take the responsibility of ensuring that the off-take agreements are there. They have the ability to sell on a bulk level. At the moment, if you look at private investment that's taking place, a big crux is the financial institutions need you to have de-risked the project from an off-take agreement perspective quite substantially. And that makes it extremely difficult, and that's why the reprogram was so successful. We need governments to work together. We need interconnectivity on grids, and the Southern Africa Power Pool, likewise the West African Power Pool, is an extremely important one. And those discussions must be had to say, how do we strengthen those in order to have the resilience in the system? I think it's a brilliant solution.
Any other comments? Anyone else? Yes, Kevin?
I'd just like to respond to Shane's observation around the curriculum for climate change. Fully support what Shane was saying and bring it down to the primary school level. But again, we spoke about the siloization, and I don't know whether that's a term or not, but the siloing of knowledge and systems and that sort of thing. And one of the key issues is that climate change is one of the driving conversations at the moment. But the reality is that the overall sustainability conversation is as important, if not more important, than just the climate change conversation. I don't know if everybody is aware of the limits to growth, the 9 planetary boundaries that were identified many years ago. Effectively, there are 9 planetary boundaries which, if we go beyond tipping points, and climate change is one of the tipping points at the moment, if we go beyond those tipping points, then the capability of the planet to support humanity and other living systems is severely compromised. And the 1.5 degree is the climate tipping point that we're talking about at the moment. Climate change on those 9 tipping points or boundaries is the 4th worst. So of the 9 boundaries, there are 3 others that have been exceeded prior to that. Water is one, biodiversity is another, and South Africa is a signatory to the biodiversity agreement, basically the protection of biodiversity. Climate change and biodiversity significantly interlinked. Geochemical and chemical and chemical flows is another one of them. The plastic pollution conversation that's going on at the moment. And I contend that what we need to do is shift that particular subject to an overall sustainability subject, of which climate change is one, because then we start creating that integration of knowledge rather than the siloization of knowledge. So I think for me that's a critical thing, and I do believe that it's got to start right at the bottom and go all the way up, basically.
In terms of skill development, it also, brings an opportunity of, when you talk about now circular economy skills or green skills, brings an opportunity of employment. Yes, we're talking about innovation, technology, but bringing innovation and technology also opens up an opportunity for young people to partake in terms of sustainability as well. But now, what kind of skills are needed for you to participate in terms of coming in of new innovation and technology? That's where skills development and capacity development comes in terms of the community level, to say, yes, we are now foreseeing or we are seeing a lot of people or a lot of graduates who are not employed. It's because of that, again, skill that is linked to sustainability, that is linked to climate change. Yes, when you start education at a lower level, it's a long term, but again, there are programs that we've seen that have been rolled out on the ground where young people are skilled up in terms so that they will be able to participate and contribute to the future of the sustainability in South Africa and in Africa as well.
Thank you. Gordon, anyone else?
Yeah, Mary, I think those observations are absolutely valid, and it's critical that they are part of the conversation and part of the implementation plan going forward. And again, I'm broadening the conversation the whole time, which is partially the role that I play in this space. If in the access to opportunity conversation, and there was a report that came out last week from the World Bank that actually took the figures higher. In the Western Cape, we talk about 40, 40, 40. 40% of our population live at or below the poverty line. They live 40 minutes away from any opportunity that they access. There's another 40 that comes into that who live probably in less than 40 square meters of space. But 40% of the take-home income is spent on transport. Now that just immediately takes out the opportunity to actually buy energy beyond the minimal that they can get on the free basis. So if we change our urban form and change the way people can travel, and all the metros are doing work in the space, the rapid transit, the bus rapid transit systems, the public transport systems, and the taxi industry has a massive role to play in this. But if we can reduce the need to travel to opportunity rapidly, that then actually unlocks money for different things to happen, basically, and it addresses some of the poverty issues that we're really talking about. And a critical area, and this is where the whole conversation shifts beyond just energy resilience. But if we can create safer spaces, there are things called, for instance, bike buses and pedestrian buses where groups of children get together and travel to and from school or opportunity together in a safer setup. That again releases funds for the families that are living in those neighborhoods. And it's a whole of society, a holistic, systemic approach. So these conversations have to be integrated at many levels. And there are examples right around the country of neighborhoods that are doing this really well. Cape Town has the Langa Bike Hub, for instance, and some of the initiatives in Khayelitsha that are addressing it. KZN has a number of their cycle academies which are doing exactly the same thing. And in the cycle academies, part of the resilience comes from creating neighborhood gardens where moms are using part of those areas as gardens to grow food for themselves and then sell to the economy, to the local economy. And again, part of the benefit of that is the fact that the foodstuffs don't have to be transported long distances. So we really start talking about it at that level. The other thing that we need to really start doing is thinking about the last mile deliveries and changing the way that we think about what last mile delivery or collection can look like. And there are many initiatives that are happening using e-bikes as a key example.
I just want to ask, just in general, everyone, what research and development is currently happening to discover maybe other energy sources?
There is work that is happening, in particular with some of the state-owned entities for the department. I know that there is work that is being undertaken by the Council for Geoscience, looking into how can we clean the coal, carbon capture and storage. That work is ongoing because, let's face it, we have more than 100 years of coal reserves in South Africa. And coal is not the problem by its nature as a resource. It's only the greenhouse emissions that come out as we're processing the coal to generate electricity. So there is solutions that are being investigated to find out how can we clean the coal so that we can still continue to utilize it as a clean coal technology that must help us to generate electricity. So there are entities that are dealing with that in the department. We've got SANEDI, which is also busy doing research on energy matters in the department. We've got NEXA, which is also busy doing research on nuclear energy matters. And so there is initiatives. It's not only focused on the known energy solutions. There are others that are being investigated. I'll stop there.
Just building on what the DDG has said, there's a tremendous focus on hydrogen as a clean energy source at the moment, with a whole hydrogen corridor concept set up in the northern parts of the country. The critical issue with hydrogen from a transport perspective is that it's very inefficient. So it's got what we call well to wheel. So coming from the source to producing energy to the wheel, hydrogen sits at about between 22 and 30%. Electricity is, depending on it may not be clean electricity, but electricity's well-to-wheel efficiency sits in the region of 60 to 75%, somewhere around there. So from a transport perspective, unless it's in really big vehicles, so heavy motor vehicles, trains, possibly buses as well, it may be a solution. But from a South African perspective, I think one of the key drivers is the export of hydrogen to countries that are seeking to move away from fossil fuels at a rapid rate, Germany, Japan, places like that, and the commitment is to drive that. We would be a beneficiary of that in the, as that unfolds. There is research out there as to alternate energy sources. People are talking about water engines and all sorts of things, but those are really in concept phase at the moment. So there is quite a bit of work done in that space. But hydrogen, although touted as a solution, we're not there yet, because a critical issue with hydrogen, and one of the conversations around the gas story is whether the gas pipelines could be used for hydrogen. The problem is that hydrogen is an incredibly small molecule and has a very, very good propensity to escape. So those pipelines are not that efficient, so it would make the energy delivery even less efficient if we were using older pipeline systems, and it's not that feasible to use them, so we'd have to create new piping systems, basically.
Thanks, Gordon. I'm surprised no one mentioned fusion. No one doing fusion?
How does South Africa link into the rest of the world to share knowledge or, reciprocate on new technology development and testing and see what else is out there?
You are absolutely right. Emissions and climate change doesn't respect borders. South Africa as a whole, in terms of research and development and through the universities that we have, are doing a tremendous amount of work to try and find innovative ways in order to be able to address climate change effects. I know, as an example, Eskom, as the local utility in South Africa, has invested in creating a process where they have a structured program with all of the universities in order to be able to try and solve energy challenges that indirectly and directly can help with reducing carbon emissions within our country. I think the reality is that if we take Africa as a whole, our realities, as you've heard from a social perspective, is very different to what it is in a European context. And it is complicated for a country like South Africa to balance our ability to invest in research and development in innovative technologies while trying to readdress the social reform that we need in our country due to the poverty and high level of unemployment that we have in a country. So those two elements are extremely difficult to balance. But are we playing our role? I think we have very clever people in the country. We have very structured approaches in terms of research and development that we are currently undertaking through our universities, through private entities and entrepreneurs trying to find solutions. The reality is that the maturity of technology that we currently have is to such a point that can it be commercialized is a big question. The world is at a point where the maturity of the technologies that we have now is really the total sum, unless there's a game changer that gets found.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that, Senedi is very engaged internationally in trying to understand what's happening, but we must also recognize our successes in Africa. The recent Assessment Review 6, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's periodic report that comes out, AR6, from South Africa and Africa, we had a number of scientists and researchers that contributed to that document, and particularly in South Africa, we had 2 leads from South Africa that were part of that process in terms of developing the document and the review processes, and then writing a specific sub-report on Africa. and the impacts and possibilities from Africa. And that I would recommend, or I do recommend, not would recommend, I do recommend that everybody goes and reads that assessment report 6, the African contribution or section in that, and possibly just at volume 3 of the AR6, which speaks to the way forward, the solutions that can be created in terms of particularly climate change. They do touch on other stuff, but particularly climate change. So Africa is actually well tapped into that, and South Africa contributing significantly to that as well.
Thank you, Gordon. Any other comments before we close all?
Well,
Right. Sorry, go DDG, quick.
yes,
if you
just
don't mind.
to expand on the research on energy matters, just to bring into perspective, South Africa, we participate in a number of multilateral organizations where research is taking place, in particular on small modular reactors. We participate in Generation 4 Forum, where a number of the small modular reactors are being investigated. We are the member state to the International Atomic Energy Agency, wherein we are able to follow and track the events and the developments in the area of small modular reactors. And we participate in a variety of these multilateral organizations to make sure that as South Africa, we keep abreast with the development of the small modular reactors because they are the future. So we want to be on the cutting edge of the nuclear energy development. We've got NEXA, which is our entity responsible for research and development in the nuclear space. So we cover a variety of all of these technologies through different state-owned entities and various departments to make sure that we stay abreast and knowledgeable about the developments that are taking place in the research and development in the energy space.
Thank you. In summarizing this discussion that we've had today, I would say there are at least 3 points that I think we should walk away with. The first is we clearly need to take a far more integrated approach in this whole issue of climate resilience. It seems to be an aspect which is very much on the back burner and not getting enough attention and needs attention in an integrated manner. It can't just be done by one group on its own. So we've got to get the teams together to start doing something. The other thing is that the issue is broader than energy. Energy is clearly a part of the game, but it's not just energy. We have to consider all the other dimensions as well that have been put on the table today. And the third point I'd make is that it needs input into the education system. And that must become part and parcel of what people who are being educated understand and know. And in particular, I would say that there needs to be a very clear understanding between the differentiation of climate change and climate resilience. I think too many people seem to think those are synonyms, and they're not. They're very different things. And the difference needs to be explained in a better way. But the most important point, I think, that comes out of today is that we must start now. Because the effects of what we don't do now will be huge later on. So in closing, let me thank the panel very much for their input. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your contribution. And may I invite the audience to recognize the panel with a round of applause. Most importantly, thank you for your attention. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
And may we just thank Dave for a very good facilitation.
Thank you.